on what's been happening in Israel-Palestine.
So much has changed about coverage of the Israel-Palestine story.
What role or how has technology affected what we do, the role of social media?
That has been one of the positive changes. What we saw was the Israelis responded with snipers. 250 yards, Israeli snipers picked off unarmed Palestinians who were instructed to shoot them in the legs. Bibi Netanyahu is a monster. Let's have a humanitarian ceasefire before I have to look into the sunken eyes of any more starving Palestinian kids. Journalism is a pillar of democracy. Keep the politicians honest, to keep shining a light where they're trying to cover up darkness.
Hello, friends. I hope you're all well. The United Nations Security Council has finally passed a ceasefire resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza, with the Americans refraining, but the British voting in favor of a ceasefire. And I'm joined by veteran broadcaster Jim Clancy. He has been a veteran broadcaster and inspiration. In fact, before I start this interview, Jim, I want to confess something that you, along with Walter Rogers and a coterie of journalists at CNN and elsewhere in the 90s, were an inspiration for journalists like myself to take up the profession. Looking back in 2024 over your career and how on what's been happening in Israel-Palestine, tell us your insights. What have you noticed? What has changed over the past 50 years or so?
Well, that makes me feel a little bit old, Ali, but I can tell you that so much has changed about coverage of the Israel-Palestine story, and so much hasn't changed at all. I think what has really changed is the multiplicity of outlets that are there, that you can get different views. You can readily access the information that the audience really wants to hear. People who are specializing in that area, obviously people who have taken sides already, who have a specific point of view that they want to support, and they are out there spreading their information, and it puts a lot more weight on the viewer. It puts a lot more weight on the listener to try to discern what it is that they want to understand about a story. And the best advice, of course, is, as it's always been, try to listen to as many voices as you can to get all of those views, to take all of them into account. What has stayed the same? Well, you know, this is a protracted conflict that has forced people into positions where they aren't able to say what they want to say, particularly in the mainstream media. There has been, over the years, a tendency on the part of some of the pro-Israeli groups to put pressure on corporate media, to bring that pressure to bear in ways that sometimes prevents Muslim or Arab announcers from finding a voice on the airwaves. Sometimes it manifests itself in trying to limit what is said, or trying to demand that the networks, you know, the really big media houses, pay attention to their point of view, a conservative point of view. And they can push that because they have various groups. And what is the result of all of that? It's less coverage of the Middle East, because you find in the major media houses, what they say is, you know what? Rather than all of this pressure, rather than all of these threats and, you know, risks of being accused of anti-Semitism, we're just not going to cover the story. And largely what you saw over, say, the past decade or more has been a reluctance on the part of the mainstream media to even tackle the issue of the Israeli-Palestine question.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, Jim. We've seen in this recent coverage, in fact, it's become more clearer in this recent coverage, this idea that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic, that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. What's your take on all of this?
Well, my take is that, you know, everybody roots for the home team. And there are those who are defending Israel, defending all of its actions, especially on the far right, especially those who support Mr. Netanyahu, that are very quick to brand criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a very serious thing. It's a very troubling thing that is painful to society itself, not just to Jewish people, but to everyone. And we have to consider that as a real threat. Obviously, in times like this, when there is so much criticism of Israel, you'll find anti-Semites, joining in the chorus, so to speak. And so you have to be really aware of that. I mean, let me just give you an example, Ali. There was a time, I think, when there was a lot of people would say things like, oh, they're behaving like Nazis. That's very hurtful. That borders on anti-Semitism. If, you try to lump them in, meaning your political opponents, with one of the worst atrocities committed in the history of mankind, and I'm talking about the Holocaust. And it's hurtful, extremely hurtful. And so I think the conscientious journalist today uses, doesn't bring up that kind of a comparison. Because if we're talking about serious, war crimes, we're talking about the possibility of genocide, we're talking about mass expulsions and ethnic cleansing, those charges are serious enough on their own. And you let them stand the test of whatever evidence you as a journalist are able to bring. And maybe it's eyewitness reports. I mean, you talk about how the media has changed. I just go back 2 years to the summer when there was those demonstrations, and it was to break down the wall in Gaza. And what we saw was the Israelis responded with snipers. And from a distance of 100, 200, 250 yards, Israeli snipers picked off unarmed Palestinians at will. And some of them were instructed to shoot them in the legs, and they awarded them, or there was reports that they were giving them points if they were able to do that kind of thing. But a lot of innocent medical workers and journalists were killed. And the news media, I'm sorry to say, really stood by. These were war crimes being committed in broad daylight. And I didn't think the media ever responded to that in the way that it should have. And it brings up, what's our responsibility as journalists?
What is it? What is your responsibility as a journalist? Let me ask you that.
Well, our responsibility is to try to get at the truth, to try to bring that out. And one of the shocking things about this conflict is the sheer number of journalists who have been killed. And now, for the first time, Ali, we're looking at them being killed with their families. Their families are paying the price as well for their reporting. I cannot remember when there was this widespread of a killing of journalists along with their families. There's no precedent for it. This is where the truth is going to come from. This is how you document what is going on. And I think that the whole conflict in Gaza, as we see it today, really needs more journalism, not less. But journalists cannot get permission to get in there. And true, you can go in, so-called embedded with the Israeli army. You're not going to get what you need. You're not going to even get close to the story.
Well, that's part of the truth. There. A small t truth. There is a side to it, and I guess what you're saying brings out a lot of questions. It brings out questions about labels. It brings out questions of power, of Orientalism. As someone who's covered a lot of conflicts yourself, you look at Ukraine a few years ago, and journalists being killed while covering that conflict, and the hue and cry that created. Do you think racism, or this idea of power and where it lies, plays a role in what we see in Gaza, the killing of journalists in Gaza and the lack of condemnation there, and the killing of journalists, let's say, in Ukraine, and overt condemnation from everywhere on that instance?
Well, sometimes, hopefully, but I wonder, are we stretching it to say that Ukrainian journalists are better protected than the journalists of Palestine? In some cases, I think there's a case to be made for that. But still, even Ukrainian journalists are horrifically targeted in these kinds of conflicts. I covered Beirut back in 1982, and it was a period in time when you could go back, you could go back and forth over the green line. And I think, one side expected you to go to the other side and cover it. In fact, they respected the fact that you were a journalist and that was your job to do that. By the time we arrived in Bosnia, a decade later, it was really a measure of who did you support in this war? Right. Whose side were you on? And that could get you access to where you wanted to go. And only that. And it led to the different treatment of journalists in different places. So that respect for the journalist has eroded over time. Whereas the media, people see, and they talk about it in every single conflict, the media war, because information is, weaponry. And because they look at it that way, journalists get treated differently. And it's a sad development, but it's what we have to deal with. The entire media industry has changed some ways, incredible changes for the positive. And in other ways, well, changes that we can't unwind easily. And that's one of them.
We talk about these labels, or, you spoke of racism, you spoke of calling someone a Nazi, quote unquote, or an anti-Semite, or conservatives, or, the MAGA movement. Do these labels even mean anything at this day and age? Because, as you said, they're points of interest that people on the other side of the aisle might have. Or let's take this particular Israel-Palestinian conflict. As you said, there are a lot of right-wing, conservative, quote-unquote, traditionally conservative people that have joined the bandwagon, so to speak, of the ceasefire in Gaza. But on the other hand, you have liberal or traditionally liberal news outlets like the New York Times or traditional MSNBC, for example. On the face of it, these who are left-leaning liberals, but there's a strain of supporting violence if it means ending the other side or violence on the other side. So do these labels even matter, where Joe Biden is, for some, seen as pushing for war, whereas this idea that Trump was an isolationist, that he didn't want wars? How does that, happen in a place like the US, all around the world?
It can change every day, Ali. It can change every day with every opinion that is voiced, and especially for Donald Trump, because he changes his mind, on the turn of a head of a pen. I think what's important as we look at, labels and things like that, that they are less important. When you look at the sudden urge of everyone to suddenly say, it's Bibi Netanyahu, he's the problem. And Senator Schumer stands up and says, the Israelis ought to elect a new leader. They ought to have elections and get rid of him. And everybody can comfortably say, Bibi Netanyahu is the problem. Well, as Mustafa Barghouti said, Bibi Netanyahu is a monster. And the way that he has pushed the right wing, the way that he has influenced and pushed the conservative settler movement forward in gobbling up more land and inflicting harsher laws, in creating settlements that are, every single one of them is considered a war crime under the International Committee of the Red Cross. But stop and wait a minute. Who enabled all of this? How did Bibi Netanyahu get away with it? Well, he got away with it because Senator Schumer and every other or most other U.S. lawmakers gave them impunity for it. You want to take some more settlement? Go ahead. There was, people would condemn it. Harsh language would be thrown. But, they never did anything to stop it. They acknowledged that, yeah, it's illegal. They shouldn't be doing that. But they let it go on.
There's an inherent hypocrisy then. There's an inherent hypocrisy then in all of this.
Exactly. In the news media, I don't know if they pick up on it or not, but they seem to have missed it in this case, that, suddenly it's all one guy. And if you get rid of him, you solve the problem. Well, no, you don't. And Ali, that comes as no surprise to you. Anyone who's covered Israel-Palestine understands there's no one thing that is going to change the entire equation here. I am reminded by David Rothkopf that there isn't a single Israeli that could be elected prime minister that is for a peace deal and a Palestinian state. Not a single one. So who are you going to elect to replace him? How are you going to move this off center? What are you going to do? True, Joe Biden has given it real lip service. I think that today there is a call that goes beyond politics, beyond political affiliations, that looks at the carnage in Gaza and says, my God, yes, let's have a humanitarian ceasefire before I have to look into the sunken eyes of any more starving Palestinian kids.
When you started journalism, Jim, and I'm assuming an ENG kit, or when you'd go out for coverage or reporting, an ENG kit would mean an expensive camera, someone to hold the audio equipment, a lighting guy, maybe a producer and a reporter. Now, when you talk about an ENG kit, this is it, a cell phone. You write your scripts on it. I'm using it to have this conversation. What role or how has technology affected what we do? And what is the role of social media in basically killing off legacy media organizations such as CNN?
Well, I don't know whether we'll ever kill them all off completely, just like I don't believe newspapers will ever die, or radio for that matter. But you're right. I mean, that has been one of the positive changes to make it possible for us with ever smaller kits to be able to report from anywhere in the world and do it live. We can do that now. It used to take, I remember my first live shot that I ever did remotely to a satellite was literally a 16-wheeler truck. Now, we had in local television, you had the golden rods and microwave links and things like that that were a little bit more compact. But, when we got down to a laptop computer and whatever camera it was we were using, I felt that we had arrived at the point that we could go live from anywhere reporting on anything. And that brought new responsibilities. So too does social media. The one thing social media doesn't have is an editor standing over your shoulder going, wait a minute, now, I don't think you want to put it like that. Some voice of wisdom hurting, and I'm glad I had somebody like that. I don't know about you, but, I see too many reporters on social media coming out and making blanket, assertions. Statements. Yeah, just, not based on anything. I mean, we saw this very early on October the 7th, when things were happening, and they began quoting, not an aid worker necessarily, but an Israeli rescue worker, and people were relating that, I heard about this, or, I talked to someone who saw this, and that was being reported as fact. We found out later that it wasn't anywhere close to the facts. Well, that's true of everything, everything that we've been reporting on over decades and decades. That eyewitness testimony is oftentimes the least reliable testimony. And, getting hearsay in a time that's really emotionally charged, and my God, October the 7th was emotionally charged. These were horrific acts that were committed by Hamas. And some of these unspeakable acts were carried out at bus stations, where all the civilians that were there were gunned down. People ran into shelters. Hand grenades were thrown in, and this was documented on video. But then we got further afield with decapitated babies, and the extent of rape we don't know because it hasn't been fully investigated. And one of the problems here is, when you're social media, you think, well, I'll just report it today, whatever it is, and I'll change it tomorrow. Well, that's not really as good on the record as getting it right and not reporting what you don't know. I mean, I think the hardest thing, Ali, for us as journalists sometimes is you get on camera live, they ask you the question, and you have to stand up and say, you know what? I don't know. I don't know. And, it takes pretty strong journalists to be able to do that because you have to understand what are going to be the repercussions if I say something and I don't really have the evidence for it. I'm not even close. And that's the consideration that gets lost on social media in citizen reporting. I think it's great. I think that it's great that there's material that's out there. But, again, this is where the viewer, the listener, has to be the guide. They have to be the person to discern, hey, how does that guy know that? He couldn't possibly know that.
So the viewer becomes the editor, essentially.
Essentially, the viewer has to be the editor. You don't have the little guy on your shoulder or the big guy standing behind you with a red pen telling you this is what you should write and what you shouldn't write. And that's a very important role. The question is, are we up for it as the audience? You know,
well, who's going to pay for it? The question is, who's going to pay for it? Having an editor is all
pay for it is the audience if they swallow all of that stuff. You know, they're going to
how are they going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And who do they pay for, right? And I guess that's what comes down. One of the reasons why we are in the mess we are is who pays for it? Who do you trust? Do you trust the people that are giving you that news, MSM versus Rebel Media? And especially at this moment where we're living in these echo chambers where, yes, it's brilliant, it cuts the cost, but it's also feeds into your own biases.
Yeah, well, you know, pretty much now the 24-hour news model that Ted Turner sponsored and wanted to build into something has been relegated to, what, 3-4 stories a day that are covered nonstop, that are highly, in the U.S. anyway, these are very highly politicized, whether it's for Biden or for Mr. Trump. And the result is TV that's almost unwatchable. There's no news there. There's no news. There are other networks that are trying to put news back into it. But, you know, if you're a farmer living in Iowa and you have some serious problems, good luck getting those viewed by the people of America, because nobody's going to take the time to listen to your problems. They're just completely focused inside the Beltway. But then there's some other news sources that are out there. We've got a disturbing disappearance of local newspapers around the U.S. There's nobody to cover the school board meetings. There's nobody to cover the city council. And you know what happens when that transpires? These guys start running away with the money. And journalism is a pillar of democracy, I think. And it's a very necessary part of a thriving, functioning democracy to keep the politicians honest, to keep shining a light where they're trying to cover up darkness.
Well, Jim Clancy, legend, broadcaster, and a really nice, humble guy to agree to speak to us on all of these issues. Tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the minority. We'll see in the elections in the United States. Thanks again, Jim.